Welcome to our Lunch and Learn on Enterprise Zones. This is the final of our spring Lunch and Learn session from What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. The Lunch and Learn sessions are short, 45-minute long sessions to help busy policymakers understand the evidence on different economic growth topics. I'm Megan Strab. I'm Head of Outreach at What Works Growth, and we help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Please do submit your questions throughout in the Q&A. At the end of our presentation, we'll then move on to the Q&A portion before we wrap up at quarter two. So with no further ado, we are going to hear today from Victoria Sutherland, Deputy Director of Evidence at What Works Growth.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. So today's topic is enterprise zones. So enterprise zones are a form of area-based initiative. So an area-based initiative is any policy that is targeted at a tightly defined geographic area. It normally involves a package of support, and the aim is to improve economic, sometimes social or environmental outcomes. So there's all sorts of different area-based initiatives. So in the past, we've had things within European Social Fund and European Regional Development Fund, which would be ABIs. And we've also had things like regional selective assistance. Enterprise zones are a particular form of area-based initiatives. They're mainly targeted at businesses, although I'll get on to a kind of exception to that in a minute. And they normally involve things like tax breaks and other incentives to help get businesses to locate to a specific location. So, for example, the UK announced 24 enterprise zones in 2011-2012. And then another 24 around 2015. And in those cases, what the enterprise zones involved were business rates, rebates, simplified planning regulations, access to super fast broadband, which of course, to our 2024 brains doesn't sound like a big deal, but obviously 11, 12 years ago, that was much rarer. Some tax reliefs on things like new machinery and plants. And on the flip side, local authorities were keen to have these because they were allowed to keep 100% of the business rate growth for the next 25 years. So there's definitely an incentive for the local area to bid for it, above and beyond the fact that the thinking here is you will encourage businesses to locate to your area, or at least locate to the enterprise zone site. Enterprise zones are actually originally a UK concept, but they've been really embraced in a number of other countries, in particular in the US and in France. Now, the US enterprise zones are very similar to what I've just described for the UK enterprise zones, but they also have a number of other things like empowerment zones and renewal communities. One of the interesting things about them, alongside the French examples, is that they have additional conditions around local hiring. So this is going to come into play in a couple of minutes when we look at the evidence, when we're thinking about how generalizable the findings are or how transferable they are. Because there are some enterprise zones that very much are just targeted at businesses and encouraging them to locate in a particular area. And there are some who do that, but also put conditions on to try and ensure that local people are benefiting from them. So enterprise zones can be quite varied, and they'll tend to vary along a number of different dimensions. So they can vary in terms of the type and the magnitude of the financial supports that the businesses get. So how much are the tax rebates or the tax incentives? How widespread are they? There can be variations in terms of eligibility for different businesses. So can any business locate, or is it restricted to businesses of size or in a particular sector or that serve particular markets? And there can also be variation in terms of how enterprise zones are selected. So what are the selection criteria? So the reason that people tend to be interested in them in the UK at the moment is that there's been a little bit of a resurgence in interest in this kind of policy area. So most people on the call will know that in the last few years, we've had both free ports or green free ports in a Scottish context and investment zones announced by the government. And, we know that there's interest in doing more of that going forward. So really what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of draw out some of the lessons from the existing evaluation evidence that might help us in terms of thinking about those investment zones and free ports and other, similar policies that might be adopted in the coming kind of years. Anyone who's been to a lunch and learn before will be sick of me saying this, but for those that are new or, indeed for anyone who hasn't been for a while and needs a recap, I think it's useful to say a little bit about what Works Growth does. So what Works centres are interested in understanding whether or not a policy is effective and, as an extension of that, cost effective. Okay, and the way that we determine that is by looking at the very kind of the most robust evidence that we have, and that is evidence where there has been a counterfactual impact evaluation undertaken. So what that means is instead of just looking at the evidence on, has anything changed? So are there more businesses? Are there more jobs, for example, in the enterprise zone area than there was prior to the enterprise zone being designated? What we do is we look at whether or not that outcome has also changed for a group of similar areas who didn't have an enterprise zone. And it's by having that comparison, we're able to establish causality. So we're able to say that the outcomes are due to the enterprise zones. Now, it should be said that doing that for anything that is area-based is generally more tricky than it is, for example, a programme that targets individuals or targets businesses. So, for example, if you had a business advice programme, you might be able to randomise which businesses get the support and which don't. And that allows you to create two groups that are very similar. But something that is intrinsic into something like an enterprise zone is you're making a very deliberate decision about where you are going to place these. So historically, they've often been put in weak economies. So what that means is it's actually harder to find different places to use as your comparison. Okay, so that has two implications in terms of, what we've got as an evidence base. So number one, it actually means you tend to have smaller numbers of studies that look at this because it's tricky. But secondly, it means that we are particularly kind of attentive to understanding what method's been used, how robust it is, what kind of controls have been used. So, we look at everything with a very critical eye, but we pay close attention in particular for this kind of policy area. So, what have we got? So we've got an evidence review on enterprise zones that we published back in 2016. And what it includes is 30 evaluations that cover 34 different interventions. Okay, so that's not as big as some of our other policy areas, so things like employment training or business advice, but still a reasonably good, kind of number of studies. At the moment, we're going through a process where we are trying to update that, because we've obviously had 8 years passed since we published it. There's been more time for the ones that are already in place, to deliver results. But also there's kind of been an expansion of these. So when we did the original review, nearly every study is either the US or France. But what we've seen is we've seen some other countries kind of come into mix. So there's a couple of studies, for example, from Poland, who've obviously kind of taken this policy, and there's been some studies looking at what's happened there. So that's added about 20 studies. I should say one of the things that we've done is, earlier I was kind of saying we're very interested in kind of methodology. Something that's evolved slightly in our thinking since 2016 when we did the original reviews, we now quite often do rapid evidence reviews or toolkits where we look at things that have a slightly lower standard. So doing that search, we've also identified about another kind of 10 or 12 studies that would be included if we look at that lower standard, but we haven't yet made a decision on whether or not that makes sense in this particular context. We've also got a couple of other things. So we've got a toolkit on local hiring requirements linked to area-based initiatives that might be of interest to people. We have a number of case studies on how to evaluate area-based initiatives. So if you're thinking of doing an evaluation, I encourage you to go and have a read of them. And the final thing that I'll flag, and I'm not actually going to talk about this yet because we haven't got sign-off from ONS to talk about the results. But one of the big gaps in both the original evidence review that we did and the update is that there are no counterfactual impact evaluations of the UK enterprise zones that were set up in the 2010s. So there's 2 rounds that I talked about earlier. We are doing an evaluation of them. So we're hoping that we might have that finished kind of later in the year and hopefully maybe, published either later in the year or perhaps early next year. So do keep an eye out for that. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is labour market outcomes. So we've got a number of different studies that look at things like employment, unemployment, wages. So employment is the outcome that by far the largest number of studies look at. So that's the thing. I was saying we've got 30 studies, but each study will look at a different slight mix of outcomes. Some will only look at one outcome, some will look at multiple outcomes, but not every study looks at every outcome. And in fact, if they did, we'd be very skeptical about that as an approach. Employment's the thing that is the most common outcome. And that's because ultimately that's kind of the objective of a lot of these policies. It's about creating new jobs within an area. That's what they're often trying to achieve, not always, but often. So there are 23 of our 30 studies look at employment, and actually they look at 27 different interventions. Some of them look at more than one. So of the 23 studies, 11 of them find a positive effect on employment. And similarly, if we look at the interventions, 15 of the 27 interventions that are looked at in the studies have a positive effect on employment. However, I think we need to be really careful when we're thinking about this, because as I said earlier, what we've got is we've got studies we've got enterprise zones of which there are evaluations of that do something similar to our current enterprise zones or investment zones, where it is a combination of planning reforms, tax incentives for businesses, etc. But then there's also these other ones that have local hiring conditions. So perhaps there's a subsidy for taking on someone from the local area. Or actually, there's a really interesting one in France where what happens is once you get to a certain proportion of your employees live locally, you as an employer are then exempt from payroll taxes for your entire workforce. So because there's those, that kind of skews the results, okay? So what we know is that those ones that have a local hiring requirement element are much more likely to have had a positive effect on employment than the ones where it's just the tax incentives, planning reforms, etc. So when we look at the ones without local employment conditions, it drops down to about a third of the studies compared to half of the studies that are finding that positive effect. So the next thing that some of the studies look at is unemployment. Okay, so the reason that you would tend to look at unemployment in addition to employment is a fear that, okay, well, what happens in the enterprise zones is it creates new jobs, but actually it's people who in-commute from another area who end up taking those jobs and local residents don't benefit. Okay, so that's why you look at unemployment as well. We only have 7 studies that look at unemployment, so a much smaller number than we're looking at our employment. But most of them are positive. So 5 of those 7 find positive effects. And again, if we look at the interventions, because some look at more than interventions, it's 7 out of the 9 that are positive. So the findings on unemployment really are probably the most positive of the different labour market outcomes. However, that rationale that I gave for kind of why we look at that, it's worth saying that none of the studies that looked at unemployment are ones where there was no effect or a mixed effect or a negative effect on employment. So in a sense, the rationale for looking at unemployment doesn't quite hold because none of the studies kind of fell into the category where that would kind of be needed. We've also got some studies that look at wages. So 11 studies and kind of 14 interventions. In this case, we are seeing, so only 4 of the studies find a positive effect, but when we look at the interventions, 7 of 14 are finding positive effects. So, depending on how you kind of count that, that's somewhere between, about 40% kind of up to 50% are finding a positive effect. And then the final one is poverty. And again, we're seeing about half of the studies are finding positive effects here. Before we move on, I suppose there's a couple of things I want to kind of reflect on here. So one is that we're seeing positive effects generally in about a kind of a third to half of cases, other than when we're looking at unemployment, where it's much harder. So that suggests that there can be impacts, but they're not always impacts. I think another thing we need to think about here is even where we're seeing impacts here, we need to always be thinking about the extent to which they're transferable, and that comes down to programme design. But while we're on programme design, I want to kind of really stress that where we're looking at these programmes, what we tend to be doing is we tend to be looking at the programme as a whole. What we have much less of a sense of is whether individual design elements, what the different role of the different design elements are, and how, most of these studies are looking at whether or not the enterprise has a zone has an impact, rather than kind of varying design elements and then figuring out which of those, works better. Just in terms of the update that we're doing, we're not ready to publish that, but kind of the initial kind of insights I would say is that the findings are very similar when we add in those new studies, with the possible exception of the employment outcomes are a little bit lower. Okay, so a number of the studies look at other things. So something that we're really interested in is whether or not it changes the number of businesses within a local area. So that's really the driver of the additional kind of jobs. And what we see is, again, it's a bit mixed, but we are seeing kind of half of the studies that look at the number of businesses find a positive effect. And then we also have one that looks at new businesses, and again, that's positive. So across the piece, that is, 3 out of 5 studies that are looking at businesses are seeing kind of a growth in business numbers or business starts. However, the challenge here is that looks like it's very much being driven by relocations rather than existing businesses growing or new businesses starting. Okay, so for example, there's one study that sees that there's both business births and relocations, but actually the relocations are much larger than the births. And then there's another one where, yes, we see births in the early years, but then once you get kind of beyond 3 years after myself, it all ends up being kind of relocations, not business births. I think the other thing that's really interesting here is that some of the studies have looked a little bit across kind of like, are there variations in this effect across different kinds of places or different kinds of businesses? So in each of these cases, there's like one study that looks at this, but there is a little bit of evidence that suggests that the effects are larger in areas that are less depressed. So if an area is doing well, then actually having this kind of intervention can help improve economic growth. But in areas that are perhaps more depressed, you're less likely to see that. There's a possibility, given that a lot of these things involve planning reform, that what that is that actually the less depressed areas actually just have a capacity issue in terms of the number of commercial sites, and that by reforming some bits of planning, that's opening up sites. So that might be one of the dynamics that's happening there. Again, areas that are better connected in terms of road and rail tend to benefit more from these than areas that are less well connected. And we also see a little bit of evidence around they have a bigger impact for sectors that have lower relocation costs. Okay, so if you imagine if you're something in manufacturing where there is a lot of plant and machinery, even if you're going to get a tax rebate or a tax incentive in a new site, the costs of moving to that new site in many cases are going to outweigh the benefits that you get from the tax incentive. So it's much harder, to make the case for moving. In an ideal world, we'd have some studies that look at commercial property prices, but actually we don't have any of those. That's a real gap in the literature and something that would be good, to see addressed. What we do have is a number of studies that look at the effects on residential property prices, and they are kind of generally positive. So, there's 3 that look at property prices. There's 4 that look at property prices, of which 3 are positive, and there's 2 that look at rents, and both of those are positive. Now, to us, with a UK kind of mindset, that seems slightly it's hard to imagine what the kind of rationale for that is, or what's driving that, I guess, is a better way of articulating that, because we're used to thinking of enterprise zones or investment zones as being really quite small areas that are often only commercial or industrial kind of land. But the thing to remember is that in the US and in France, often they're much larger areas. So I think an empowerment zone in the US on average is about 11 square miles and has a population of about 120,000 in it. So often it's because the way these policies are kind of designed means that you have a much larger residential population in them than we have in here. And what you're seeing there is you're seeing the amenity benefits being incorporated into the property prices. So perhaps there's more investment into public realm, perhaps because of the increased focus, there's less, vandalism or crime, and that the amenity value is being captured in those prices. For economists, the big issue that we worry about in relation to a policy like enterprise zones is one of displacement. Okay, so when we're talking about the number of businesses or the number of jobs, our worry is that yes, you're seeing the numbers of jobs or the numbers of businesses going up within the enterprise zone, but actually what that's doing is that is being offset by jobs elsewhere. So basically, a firm is located in one area and it is moving to the area that's got the EZ designation and therefore has the tax incentives, is a better option for them. Surprisingly few of the studies in our evidence review actually look at displacement. And there's actually a whole host of reasons why that is in terms of why it's actually technically quite difficult to do this. But pretty much every study that does look at displacement finds that, when they've looked for it, they've generally found it. Okay, so that for you as policymakers is the thing that I would worry the most about in relation to these policies is, are you just moving around activities, or are you does program design genuinely lead to more businesses, more jobs for your local area? And then final thing on this slide, I actually touched about on the last slide, I actually got ahead of myself, which is, we just don't have much evidence on which incentives or which mix of incentives are most effective. Okay, so in terms of thinking about these policies, we think there's a few different issues that it's worth kind of thinking about as a policymaker. So the first thing is to be really clear about what you're trying to achieve, So area-based initiatives and enterprise zones in general could be about increasing employment. They could be about reducing unemployment. They could be about improving kind of business outcomes. So whether that is something like capital investment, productivity, they could be about improving, the infrastructure, the commercial properties that you've got. They could have, benefits in terms of things like poverty and social exclusion. Okay. Doing all of those things is very difficult. And I think one of the real challenges around this is like making, that if actually you've got too many things in the mix, it can be very difficult to achieve anything. And in particular, what could be really difficult is when actually how they're selected is based on, kind of reducing unemployment, reducing poverty, but actually the levers that you end up with your disposal are all about, kind of increasing investment in machinery, about, things that help encourage, businesses to invest. So I think the first thing I would say is if you're doing one of these things, have real clarity about what you're trying to achieve, and make sure that your incentives reflect that. Now, historically, that'd be quite difficult to do, but it is really interesting that the investment zones, as they're currently kind of, the current iteration of them that we have in the UK, is there's a range of different incentives on offer, but it's up to the individual area to decide what the mix of those are. So, I think that's particularly important in relation to that, the design of our current iteration. I think given what I've just set out in terms of the findings for the evaluations, is I think we really need to be realistic about the potential impact. A lot of that comes down to the fact that actually tax incentives will nearly always account for a very small percentage of business costs. And therefore, whilst it seems like it's a strong lever, it isn't actually always. There's also a high likelihood of dead weight. So that is, the firms will do what they were always planning to do. And, you're getting they get the tax rebate, despite the fact that they're doing exactly what they were planning to do anyway. In a sense, at the local level, that maybe matters slightly less, because you're not the people that are paying out tax rebates, but it does matter at a national level. I would take displacement, kind of very seriously. Like that, figuring out whether the thing you're doing is actually going to make a difference overall to your area. Now, there's different ways in which we could kind of tackle the issue of displacement. I mean, one of them is actually just to make the areas larger, but obviously the cost of that begins to get, very high very quickly, when we're talking about tax incentives. But the other one is that actually, if we can target, so perhaps we target things that are tradable. So that is, things where we are selling to international or national markets, or indeed, if we decide the employment stuff is important, that we're targeting firms who are going to change their behaviour in response to that incentive. There is one additional note that I'd add here, which is sometimes for an area, even if you've got displacement, there might be benefits that come from getting to a point where all of your firms are kind of co-located onto a single site, facilities, etc.